Thank you for joining us, OpenAir. We're excited to be here as part of the virtual pavilion at Carbon Removals at COP. And today we're going to be having a discussion about building a CDR grassroots movement. My name is Toby Bryce, based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy with OpenAir. Purpose today is to really talk again about building a carbon dioxide removal grassroots movement to generate greater understanding of and interest in broadly communicating the need for CDR. If you're not familiar with OpenAir, we are a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of CDR solutions that are essential to solving the climate crisis. We're a global community, we're growing, and we collaborate, work together on shared open source missions in the areas of CDR research and development, communications and messaging, which we'll be discussing today, and policy advocacy. Please check out our website, openaircollective.cc. There's a join link there. You can fill out a form and become part of what we're doing, and we'd love to have you. Before we get started, whenever we do any of these programs, we like to define the terms that we're talking about. When we talk about carbon dioxide removal or CDR, the definition is purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and to durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. This definition is from a book. It's now a published book called the CDR Primer, which is a great resource to learn more about CDR. And it's also essentially the same definition that the IPCC uses in their work. Two important things to call out, which we'll discuss further in this program when we talk about carbon removal. Number one, it's really important to disambiguate carbon removal from what is commonly called carbon capture. Carbon capture typically means capturing CO2 from a point source emissions, whether it's a natural gas power plant or a cement plant. That may or may not be a good climate solution depending on the circumstance, but it's a form of reducing emissions. It is not carbon removal. Again, carbon removal is removing CO2 from the atmosphere and durably storing it. Number two, when we talk about carbon removal, it's really important to highlight up front that carbon removal is in no way, shape, or form any sort of substitute for reducing emissions or excuse not to reduce emissions. We need to reduce emissions as quickly as possible and decarbonize our global economy, full stop. That said, there's clear scientific consensus that carbon removal will be required for us to meet our climate goals of limiting warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius, because there are going to be certain emissions that we're just not going to be able to eliminate in a climate relevant time frame. Examples of these are emissions from the agricultural sector and food systems, which would account for approximately a third of global emissions. We're just simply not going to be able to completely eliminate those by 2050 or even 2100. That means that we are going to be required to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Again, the scientific consensus, including with the IPCC, is that carbon removal will be necessary at gigaton scale by mid-century. That's billions of tons per year. Again, if we want to have any chance of meeting our climate goals, and we're currently at kiloton scale. So carbon removal is an essential climate solution alongside emissions reductions and also adapting to our current already changed climate. And it's something that we need to get started scaling up right now. I'm going to hand it over to my OpenAir friend and colleague, Tina Baumgartner, who's going to tell us a little bit more about today's program, and we're going to go from there. But thank you. Hi, Tina.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks for the introduction. I just want to quickly set the scene for what we're trying to achieve with this webinar today. You have already mentioned that CDR is an important tool in the fight against global warming, but it's not very well understood, nor is it widely known. There's a lot of confusion around what CDR and what is not. Toby just mentioned the confusion around CDR and CCS, the latter being sequestering CO2 from a smokestack. Another thing that people often do not realize is that CDR is not one method or technology, but a broad range of solutions that span a whole spectrum, from mostly nature-based approaches, reforestation come to mind, to more technology-driven solutions like direct air capture. But this webinar is not about discussing all those misunderstandings, but about building a global movement by recruiting people like yourself to help get the facts about CDR out into the world and work on dispelling already existing mis and disinformation. We know it's an ambitious goal, but we know there is strength in numbers, and that recruiting many people who have meaningful dialogues is the best way to get the word out and people to act. So this is what we'll do today. First, communications expert Ann Pasek will give a presentation with the title Communication Lessons for CDR, what we have learned from decades of climate communication research. And then Toby will do a Q&A session with Ann before we invite 3 members of the OpenAir community to join us to share their experiences reaching out to various audiences. But without further ado, let me introduce Anne, who is an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in Media, Culture, and the Environment at Trent University. Anne is an expert in climate change communication and an advisor to the OpenAir Collective. Anne, over to you.
Thanks so much, Tina. All right, so thanks again. So today I'll be summarizing some research from the field of climate communication research, which is where I do most of my thinking. And I'll be focusing on patterns that are specific to the United States and Canada, but not unique to them. These patterns repeat to varying degrees in most every country. So I hope that this will be useful to CDR and climate advocates throughout the world. And I'm going to start with some trends in climate polling and politics, and then offer a couple of big lessons for effective communication. So the first thing I should mention is that party affiliation is the biggest predictor of climate belief. Who you vote for tells me a lot about whether or not you support climate action. And this makes sense, right? Because party members have shared values, they have shared priorities, all of which line up differently on questions like mitigation or adaptation. But it's also the case that many parties have used climate as a wedge issue. We've seen disinformation campaigns within or adjacent to different partisan views on climate change, such that it's made climate a really contentious issue, such that support for climate action, phrased as such, can really be a social signal for whether or not you belong to the group. And that's really unfortunate because it means that we often sit down to talk about climate change, but end up not debating policy, but debating people's identities, which is rarely a productive topic of conversation. We also find some really key regional differences in climate belief. These correlate with partisan affiliations to a degree, but there's also obvious patterns in and around fossil fuel producing regions. And this tells us that there are real regional economic concerns tied up in this picture, right? People are worried about losing their livelihoods and ways of life, but they're also worried about judgment from people who live and work in other parts in other countries, who might cast them as villains of the climate story. And so we often see people double down in their support for the ethical value of fossil fuel industries. And they'll report feeling surrounded or embattled, and so are just often not in a position to soberly consider the science and work towards a policy consensus. So how do we break this divide? In order to build political power for climate action, we need to both reach new advocates and demobilize opposition. And this requires developing some pretty clever communication strategies. But thankfully, we have some research that does point in some helpful directions. And I'm going to highlight just two major themes in that research. The first is that empathy is really important. And when I say this, I'm not being sentimental. I'm talking strategy. So we have great research demonstrating how effective communicators from a wide variety of different audiences, belief systems, and subcultures can all reach previously disengaged or hostile audiences by connecting with them through shared values. So this often means not letting the science stand in the center of what you're trying to say, but instead focusing on how climate action aligns with already existing ethics and practices within that group. And these are really specific. There's usually a whole language built up around them that makes immediate sense to people in these communities, but won't necessarily be intuitive to people outside them. So we need folks inside these many different social formations, whether that's religions, professions, hobbies, or other identities, who are working to translate that science into language and concerns that are authentic to that group. But this doesn't mean that good communication only happens within small groups. There's a really exciting body of research developing around the idea of deep canvassing, where members of a particular group have extended conversations with people that aren't like them, in the hopes of connecting with them and connecting them to an issue that now has a human face and story. And this developed and has been piloted by members of the LGBTQ community, though it hasn't yet been fully embraced by climate activists. I think there's pretty strong potential there. It does require a bit of time and resources. These conversations usually run for about 10 to 20 minutes and require a bit of training in advance, but they can really effectively break through polarization, which is exciting news for climate. But what do you do after you've reached an audience? This brings me to my second big point. Climate psychologists are increasingly suggesting that most people who are worried about climate change don't talk about the fact that they are worried, don't do anything despite being worried, and will even tell you maybe that climate change isn't real despite their inner anxieties. And this is because it's really uncomfortable to think about the implications of our climate trajectories and futures if the science is right. And this is understandable. We're talking about some truly frightening future scenarios at global scales of action that can make us feel individually quite powerless and overwhelmed, and that's a bad feeling. And this sometimes gets discussed as the myth of climate apathy. It may look like we all don't care about climate change, but the truth is we care a lot. We care so much that we get overwhelmed and we avoid the issue. But the good news is that you can provide people with credible steps to take, and many will take them because action feels better than despair. But not all actions are equal. And a lot of climate communications historically has focused on like small personal behavioral changes that, might play some connection to a wider climate picture, but in the big scale of things are honestly probably insignificant. And so there's a risk here that if we as a communications community underplay it, then we really effectively aren't offering real solutions that will help with people's climate anxiety. Another problem that many calls to action in environmental movements and journalistic accounts of climate change have put forward is the notion that the public needs to not do something to act on climate change or to give something up. And math like this might be credible in the particulars of CO2 mitigation, but from my perspective, it's really a very terrible formula for bringing people into social movements. It doesn't build a sense of community among advocates, and it doesn't provide any feedback that you can use to measure progress towards a shared goal. And additionally, it can be a bit tone deaf for many people who face structural barriers to following this kind of advice, or who have strong personal values around things like being able to have children. So it's just not a good political strategy going forward. So researchers and activists have increasingly moved away from these sorts of personal behavioral prompts and towards bringing people into social movements that provide the opportunity to influence the world around you, to form social ties, and to pursue challenges that are meaningful and impactful in ways that really feel like we're taking the stakes seriously. And with proper organization, these movements can sustain people's engagement and they can feel good to be a part of. But what does this all mean for carbon dioxide removal? I'm going to present both one case for optimism and two cases for concern, or we could think about two calls to action. One thing that CDR advocates have going for them is that the public generally doesn't know what CDR means, and so don't have decades of polarization inflecting how they think about the issue. And in studies in the UK and United States, we find that really only between 5 to 10% of people say that they have a good amount of knowledge on this topic. But once you start to open people up to that discussion, people do engage and they ask a lot of really smart questions. And they generally aren't pulled one way or another for or against, but instead approach the issue with a lot of nuance, pointing to real benefits and potential risks of different kinds of CDR policies. And that's really great news, because if this were true for the climate in general, we would just be so much closer to a lot of mitigation wins. On the opposite side of things, it's concerning that there aren't a lot of social movements out there talking with people about CDR and advocating for certain kinds of policies over others. And this means that discussions about the technology aren't connecting to those movement infrastructures and values that we know can drive political engagement and bring much needed energy and diverse perspectives to the discussion. Thirdly, it seems like where there are discussions, they're often proceeding in parallel tracks with a significant disconnect between experts and the wider public. So if you talk to climate professionals about CDR, you've probably heard a lot about climate models, right? The way the technology is really necessary to making the math work out by the end of the century. And there's often the assumption that the key fight lies in getting projects funded and built. And to be sure, those are real challenges. But if you talk with a wider group of everyday people, particularly in the rural spaces where this stuff might actually get built, they tend to think about CDR's potential impacts on land, on economies and governance systems that are local to them. And they have real concerns about what looks like highly technical interventions. And they often have a distrust of projects that, seem to come from afar without a lot of local deliberation or benefit. So this disconnect in part is driven by a lack of CDR communicators out there, also a lack of deliberative spaces for meaningful public engagement in many communities, and also by the weird state of our media systems today, where information tends to move in unconventional and unvetted ways, with real losses in news coverage in these small rural communities that may be these future sites of CDR hubs. The good news, however, is that solutions here seem pretty straightforward. We need to build more opportunities for engagement and dialogue around these technologies. And then we need to organize groups together to advocate for the futures that they want. And of course, just because it's simple doesn't mean that it's easy. But I do think that we're in a really, really key moment for this work, and that there's the potential to make inroads much more quickly than is currently possible for climate advocacy in general. So on that note, I'll say thanks for listening and that I look forward to your questions.
That was great. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you for sharing that with us. It was very thought-provoking. And we do have a few questions that we kind of crowdsourced in advance from our OpenAir audience. And some of this you kind of covered in your presentation, so it might be a bit of a recap, but I'm just going to go ahead and go through them. The first question that came from our group, what would you rate as the biggest challenges or challenge ahead for carbon removal, communications, and advocacy? Get to rank them.
I think a big challenge is that there aren't a lot of central organizations that are engaging around this work. So there's lots of interesting things happening in decentralized corners of the internet and in different communities and policy circles. But there's not like a space to go and drive that forward in a concerted way. And we know that it's possible to have immaculately beautiful messages, but if you don't have an infrastructure to get your message out, it may be the case of a tree falling in the forest. So I think a lot of effort that I see bubbling in the surface is surrounding that question, trying to figure out how to coordinate and build a grassroots movement.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's something OpenAir works on a lot, but we are coming from our own little corner of the world and trying to get bigger, but it's definitely a challenge. I do think, this will be part of the larger program, but the Carbon Removals Virtual Pavilion at COP27 has a lot of great information. And I think the idea is to build on that as a foundation for the kind of centralization of messaging that you're talking about. Speaking of which, how important do you mentioned kind of empathy as being number one, which I totally get. How important are things like word choice and framing and metaphors, sort of the syntax of how we communicate about carbon removal? How important would you say those things are? And are there any aspects of those that you think are particularly important for us to focus on?
Yeah, so there's a really robust literature in communication studies about this issue. Framing is our sort of central language for discussing it. We know that you can really shift public opinion and reception in meaningful ways based on key associations that come to mind with how you tell a story or the words that you use. But that said, there's no universal formula for anything that will work. So I think that it's sort of incumbent on communicators to kind of think deeply about what words and associations fit the context they're trying to reach. And then also, to experiment a little bit and see when the spaghetti sticks to the wall, as it were.
Interesting. Yeah. Good. That's a great answer. And you talked about this again, but when we're dealing with people who disagree with our point of view on carbon removal, how would you recommend we engage with them? And I know you mentioned empathy and would love to maybe dig into that a little bit more and how can you show empathy? And maybe I'll give a specific example. In my experience, the primary opposition to carbon removal, it's not Republicans, it tends to be advocates on the environmental left who view carbon removal as a false solution. And, I think that they're coming from a good place and that we're likely to agree about 95% of climate policy, but but because of where they're coming from, carbon removal is kind of anathema to them. So how can we have this conversation? A lot of times the door is shut for it. And how can we have this conversation? How can we show empathy and try to engage in a dialogue?
Yeah, I think one key strategy is to always begin with where you do agree, and to just kind of make sure that you have that commonality set up before you want to litigate the details of where you might depart. So for the case in this particular instance, for folks who have a kind of preformed negative association with, CDR being the sort of domain of fossil fuel companies and false promises, it may be productive to begin with the conclusion that, yeah, there probably are some instances where things would bend that way. And so let's then have a conversation about what it might look like to ensure that that isn't the outcome, right? Like what kind of policy safeguards would be necessary for us to have a proposal we can both agree on. And
right.
Yeah, you'll probably find you're halfway there.
One thing that I've found helpful in engaging in these kinds of dialogues is just to really strongly emphasize up front, like we do in front of almost all open air communications, is that emissions reductions have to be strongly prioritized, and 90+% of our investment in climate solutions need to go into decarbonization and reducing emissions. And that has, for me at least, has helped unlock a little bit conversations. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe another way to get that door further open is to think about people who are very dissimilar from you, but are arguing for a similar position. So just to name one example, Olufemi Taiwo is a philosophy professor who's written a really, really great book proposing that carbon dioxide removal could act as climate reparations. And like, I think that, in those instances, like that's not a technical policy proposal, that's a justice-based claim. And so it's useful to kind of have that pluralistic table of perspectives on this issue, because we can take a lot from all of them and see them together in a productive way.
Yep, that's a great point, and we're a huge fan of Professor Taiwo. One more freelancing question on this topic. There's a big dichotomy out there between nature-based and technological or engineered. I think climate solutions more generally, but certainly carbon removal. There's a lot of great research out there. There's and you may be familiar with them, but Rob Bellamy in the UK and Shannon Asaka here in the US have written a paper about how that maybe is not the most useful frame or dichotomy, and that we should try to focus less on the label of the method and more on the method's characteristics, whether it's cost, environmental justice considerations, additionality, durability, et cetera. Do you have any thoughts on that dichotomy? Would you agree with that, or do you have a different approach to thinking about that issue? Because that's one that comes up a lot for us as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people in this space will bump into this, whether they intend to pursue the question or not, right? Overwhelmingly, a lot of the public response to CDR is that it sounds a bit like mad science, and more familiar, longer established nature-based solutions like tree planting have positive associations, and the precautionary principle seems to apply there much less. But there is this, unfortunate case where like the sufficiency of those solutions and also the extent to which they really do robustly follow through on the promise of having green virtues and social benefits is worth a strong double check.
Right.
I in my own academic work, think a lot about carbon dioxide removal as a kind of infrastructural proposal rather than a technology versus nature thing. So it's a question of like maintenance, it's a question of repair, and that sort of framing can cue us to ask different questions and think about longer term and the interesting ethics that apply rather than just saying technology bad, nature good.
Right. And I think the other issue is that it's not a binary, because basically every carbon removal method has a nature-based component. It's based on some sort of natural process, and unless we're just letting nature rewild, there is human intervention as well, which is a technology and or engineering approach. So, I think that's it's really, I think again, like focusing on those characteristics is really important. Just last question, and we're going to move on with the rest of the program. And this has been amazing. So thank you so much. What would you say, just for a group like OpenAir or anyone who's looking to advance carbon removal, in terms of messaging and communications, what do you think are the most important next steps for someone who's working on this? Like, what should we be focusing on?
I think it would be really, really useful to both focus inwards and outwards. So in an inwards perspective, we should think about movement building, right? Like, how does OpenAir expand its membership? What's the ladder of engagement? How does it recruit? And then also, how does it kind of match its resources to its programs and make those strategic decisions? And then externally, we should also think about like what are key constituencies that are underrepresented in the movement to date that should be engaged. And then also what are just like useful places to go and do this work, whether that is the strengths of its members in belonging to different communities that can sort of do that in-group communication work, or whether that is finding a really strategic space, maybe somewhere where there's a policy being proposed where we want to do a bit of campaigning, and then doing some of that out-group communications outreach. Yeah, it's never only just one thing.
Right.
It's always this dynamic movement, but
Right.
that's what makes it interesting.
No, that's amazing. And it's really good to focus. And I feel like that's really great advice on how we should be thinking about things. We're out of time, and I know you have other things that you need to move on to, but thank you so much for being with us. It was a really great presentation, and I really enjoyed meeting you in the discussion. So thanks so much.
Cheers.
Cheers to you. And I'm going to hand it over again to Tina, who's going to take us on to the next part of the program.
Thank you. That was amazing. I thought really interesting. So our next part of the program is that we bring on 3 of our OpenAir Collective members who have done different forms of outreach already. And we'll start with Peter. Peter Hoberg, he's an engineer in Santa Rosa, California, and has spent most of his career in sales and marketing. He is a relatively new addition to OpenAir with about 6 months on his back. And he started sharing information about CDR within his network. Hey, Peter, welcome.
Yes, hi, Tina. Thank you.
So, Peter, hi. Do you mind telling us how you got started?
Sure. I've been sort of interested in and aware of climate issues generally for a long time, but it wasn't till I came across OpenAir and really started to learn that really started to learn about CDR, and I got excited about it because not only is it a necessary element, but it's also something that is maybe a little more hopeful. So I started participating in a lot of OpenAir events. So one of those events was a messaging workshop, and this was where the participants were challenged to sort of create presentations which communicated the general and nature of CDR to their network, and so that's how I got involved. But through this messaging workshop, I decided that I would develop a presentation which I could share with my network.
So you mentioned network. So whom did you target there?
So in the workshop, we talked about different ways to target different audiences, like friends and family or religious groups or local government. In my case, I thought the best thing for me would be to leverage off of a club that I'm in. I'm in a Rotary club in my community. Rotary is a international service club with thousands of clubs worldwide, and I belong to one in my specific community. But because that's a network, that I was thinking that a lot of people with a lot of experience, and that would be a good way for me to sort of open up this issue and create a dialogue among that community.
So was that your primary objective, to open a dialogue about it? Or
yeah, it was really my primary focus was awareness and getting a conversation started. I don't have, because I'm new to CDR, I don't have a specific project or legislation or anything specifically in mind. It's more general. I want to create a dialogue. I want people to be aware of CDR and how it fits in the overall climate related issues, as Toby's already discussed. So that was the idea, just building awareness, creating a dialogue, and building maybe a path towards some action in the future.
So have you done any of those workshops or
presentations? Oh yeah, I have done several presentations already to various Rotary clubs in my community, and I'm now planning some additional ones. And so far, I would say that it's been very very good. As Anne pointed out, the awareness is very low. People were not familiar with CDR, and so I think the light bulbs kind of go on. People learn some new things, but it'll take a while for that to sink in, I think. So we're just getting started with that awareness building.
Okay, and so what are your next steps? You're going to continue?
I'd really like to continue. I'd like to do more clubs, more Rotary clubs in the area where I live, extend it out, and maybe start doing some through Zoom and reach some international audiences, because I think there's a lot of opportunity to build a common understanding and possibly to develop or support projects that relate to CDR. So I'm still exploring that and hoping something will develop in the future.
Super exciting. Thanks, and good luck with that.
Thank you.
So let's bring on our next panelist, and that's Jay Iyengar. He is a project manager with a large consulting firm in Dallas, Texas. He's very excited about opportunities for climate-related volunteer work in Texas. Hey, Jay.
Hey, thank you, Tina.
So, same question for you, Jay. Tell us a little bit more how you got interested in CDR and active in the space.
Yeah, Tina, having followed climate change for over 20 years, I have begun to lose hope, actually. It is obvious that just by reducing CO2 emissions, we do not solve the problem of rising sea levels. Because even if we reach net zero emissions, we still have a high level of CO2 that traps the heat. But that all changed recently. I read this book, Climate Restoration. For the first time in many years, I have a real sense of hope. It talks about 4 methods of carbon dioxide removal, CDR. These are permanent, scalable, and economically viable methods of removing these greenhouse gases. The best part is these methods mimic nature, and so there are no unwanted side effects. So I devote a few hours every week to educate friends and neighbors about CDR methods and encourage them to share with others as well. I joined the Foundation of Climate Restoration, f4cr.org, and volunteer along with some friends to start a chapter in Texas. So we have even started reaching out to the offices of congresspersons of our district for CDR legislative advocacy.
So that's interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I wouldn't necessarily think of Texas thinking of climate related.
Yeah, so it entails having conversations about the climate situation and then talking about CDR solutions. At present, there is a bill in Congress. It's called the HR 7434, which sets guidelines, targets, and price points for CDR. Basically, it will authorize Department of Energy and other government departments to prioritize procurement of products and services that use carbon negative technologies. The idea is to incentivize innovation and subsidize initial costs, like it has been done in the past for technologies like petroleum, natural gas, fracking, solar, wind, etc. We have done subsidies or incentives for all these technologies. We are in the process of reaching out to the Texas congresspersons' offices to set up appointments for, say, 30-minute meetings to talk about CDR.
Interesting. So the goal of these meetings is then?
Yeah, the primary objective is to quickly educate the staff member of the congressperson about this bill and its provisions and how CDR can be an economic driver in the district, the specific district. Answer questions about the bill and request the support of the congressperson to be a co-sponsor of the bill.
Have you done any of those meetings yet? And if so, what have you learned?
Yeah, so we have actually started doing the monthly chapter meetings of our chapter of Foundation for Climate Restoration in Texas, and then there are many Texans and live in many districts that are willing to reach out to their representative or the congressperson's offices. And we have already reached out to the Texas Congressional District 26, where I live, and Dr. Burgess, who is the congressperson from this district for the last 20 years, his office, and then we had a conversation with a senior member of his staff, and that was very, very well received, actually. As CDR solutions are actually all economic drivers, there is genuine interest from both sides of the aisle. That's one of the important lessons that we came out or we found. Some may need more time to align than the others, but the key thing is to be patient and relentlessly have the dialogue going and refrain from any stereotyping. Texans are open to business and economic ideas, and then they will support this.
Interesting. So what's next for you and your group?
Personally for me, the next step is to share as widely and invite more and more friends to join the chapter, use all avenues possible, and help chapter members to create compelling messages relevant to their district and share with their representatives. Support follow-up conversations, answer specific questions, arrange for in-person meetings, and also fundraising. So these are some of the next steps that I have.
Good luck to you.
Hey, thank you so much.
Sounds really good. Sounds exciting.
Awesome.
So,
thank you.
Let's bring our last panelist in now, and that's Janine Kong. Janine, you're a student, right?
Yes, I am.
So what are you studying?
So I'm studying criminal justice and I'm doing a minor in environmental science and policy.
Yeah, when I read that, I was like, wow, that's an unusual combination. Interesting. So, but I'll ask you the same question I asked the other two. How did you get involved with the OpenAir Collective, specifically, and CDR in general?
So I only recently became interested in solving climate issues, probably within the last 2 to 3 years. And then about 6 months ago, my sister, who's also part of OpenAir, she introduced me to this group, which was the first time I learned about CDR. And so I soon got the opportunity to help launch a short video series for OpenAir's social media platforms. And I thought this was really fitting for me since I was part of the generation that grew up with smartphones and social media.
Yeah. Could you share one of the videos with us?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
Hey guys, Janine here. So, CDR means carbon dioxide removal. CCS means carbon capture and sequestration. There's a lot to know about these two climate-related things, but the most important is
they're not the same thing.
CDR is when you take carbon dioxide that's already in the air, out of the air, erasing emissions from the atmosphere. CCS is when you stop carbon from ever getting into the air by capturing it at big industrial smokestacks. Both carbon captured from smokestacks and carbon removed from the air can be stored underground geologically. They can also be stored in things that we make a lot of, like concrete. Some forms of CDR store carbon in forests, soil, minerals, the ocean, and different natural waste materials. But we can talk about that some other time. So that's it. CDR and CCS.
Not the same thing.
Bye.
Awesome. Love it. Can you tell us a little bit more about your video series?
Yeah, so the series is called Know This, and it basically consists of short, entertaining videos like what you just saw. Each one is about 90 seconds or less, And I talk about different CDR subtopics. So the one you just saw talks about the difference between CDR and CCS. And then I did 2 other videos that talk about the moral hazard risk of removing carbon, as well as the potential of basalt to store carbon. And these videos use really simple language, so you don't need any sort of technical background to understand what I'm talking about.
And what are the channels you're using to get them out? Is it TikTok or?
So we have it on YouTube and Instagram, and we plan on putting them on TikTok as well, but it's not there yet.
Okay. And who's your target audience?
So I have a couple of different target audiences. So the first one, I hope to reach people who care about climate issues, but they might not think that they can do anything about it or make a difference. And I also hope to reach younger kids and just generally people who might not know what they're passionate about yet.
Okay. So your objective is to make people aware and hopefully get them to act. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I hope to spark some sort of inspiration and interest in these people who watch these videos about CDR. And I also want people to recognize the urgent need for CDR, and I want them to know that they are capable of making a difference.
I'm sure you have already a number of ideas for future videos on climate restoration, right?
Yeah. So I think the more ideas means more opportunities to get people interested and involved in this kind of work.
Okay, super exciting. Well, we'll hope to see more from you very soon.
Definitely. I think the work done by OpenAir is super important.
Thanks. So now that we've heard from our 3 panelists, I'd like to open up the discussion. We've heard about the what you all are doing, but how about the why? What motivated you to spend your time advocating for CDR? Peter, let's get started with you again.
Sure. Thanks, Tina. I would just, as I mentioned earlier, I've been involved and aware of climate issues for many years. 5 years ago, I live in California. 5 years ago, a wildfire ravaged my community, and I was fortunate our home was spared, but many of my neighbors were not so fortunate. And that had a big impact on me to emphasize that Mother Nature can be a little bit rough, and we haven't been, the climate is a real issue, and the droughts that we're seeing are real, and this is really starting to hit home. And so I really wanted to do something, and I've been trying to be more active, and this OpenAir thing and the getting connected with CDR has just been a way for me to, as Ann said, to participate and to feel like you're acting, and that just makes me feel so much better about it than just being in despair. So
thanks. Jay?
Yeah, so Tina, I grew up in a coastal town, southern part of India, and used to live less than 2 miles from the beach. We used to go there very often. A lot of coconut trees on the coastline, and India has about 5,000 miles of coastline. And just to think of this coastal, the sea level rise in the coastal areas are going to be inundated in 20 to 30 years is I cannot even imagine that, and the climate and the crisis, the humanitarian crisis that's going to follow that, it's unthinkable. So I want to do something about it. I'm going to devote the rest of my life to do something if that's what it takes.
Thank you for sharing. And you, Janine?
Yeah, so like I said, I kind of recently became interested in solving climate issues, and I kind of came to the realization that there are a lot of problems in this world, a lot of different problems like poverty, access to education, government corruption, just to name a few. I could talk about it all day, but my point is that I think climate change is the most urgent issue, and I don't think there is really any point in solving any other major problems in this world if the world isn't even in a livable state. And I think leaving climate change unresolved would also make it harder to solve other types of issues like food insecurity, public health issues, and other social inequities that would be worsened by climate injustices. And on a different note, I also worry about what the future looks like, and I think about my generation and my generation's kids and their kids and so forth. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And I realize your focus is broader on climate change communication in general, not just CDR, but maybe you could comment on what motivates you to spend your time, like today, on CDR.
Yeah, so I'll say that climate politics fascinate me because they are a politics that intersects with so many different values, conflicts, disputes, hopes. It really is the kind of sum of all of our history and really a passport to many different futures. But I think that we're in the middle of a really consequential shift in what those politics will look like. When the debate stops being exclusively about mitigation and adaptation and about this trickier third category of climate repair, I find, like all of the panelists, a lot of hope in that premise, and also a lot of conviction that we won't get there through hope alone, and that it will require a lot of effort and a lot of public participation to make sure that we move as quickly as we need to in the best possible direction to secure human flourishing for the years to come.
Thank you. What I like about all these statements is that sense of hope. There is something we can do. And if we engage, all of us can not just feel better about ourselves and not despair, but actually make a meaningful difference. I'd like to thank you all, Anne, Janine, Peter, and Jay, for sharing your insights and experiences. And I hope our audience, in hearing your stories, is inspired to take action as well. I also want to take a few seconds to thank our two behind-the-scenes guys, Daniel Bernard and Rob Khan, who were really crucial in making this webinar happen. Thanks, guys. And with that, I'm turning it back over to Toby to wrap up.
That was fantastic. Thank you all for being with us. It's great to see my fellow OpenAir members, if only on Zoom. And thank you again so much for joining us. That was a great presentation and really helped set the stage for the discussion. Just a few housekeeping notes. Again, here is our website, which should be put in the show notes. We are an open group and we're adding new members weekly, and we'd love to have you be a part of what we're doing. As Jay and Janine and Peter alluded to, we have all sorts of different projects, which we call missions happening, sort of self-organized, member-driven, and you can either join one of those, or if there's something you're interested in working on, you can create your own mission. We organize ourselves on an online platform called Discord, and lots of great conversations going there. So again, we'd love to see you be a part of what we're doing. And then one final note, we have a weekly, or not, it used to be weekly. We're kind of like making it a little more sporadic now, program called This is CDR. And it's an online event series. And the purpose of it, we launched it in August of 2021 to start contextualizing carbon removal in some of the ways we talked about today, to differentiate it from carbon capture, to explain how it's not a false solution, to explain that it's not just giant factories, but a range of all sorts of different methods, from biochar to ocean-based methods to direct air capture that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And we're super thrilled and pleased to have with us next Tuesday, the 15th, at noon Eastern time, New York time, Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, who really is the godmother of carbon removal. She wrote literally the first book on carbon removal, and she is now the, I'm going to get the title not quite right, but the First Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Department of Energy, and she leads the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, which she renamed to include carbon management. And she's going to tell us, kind of give us a state of the state on carbon removal in the US, tell us what's coming up. And there are all sorts of amazing goals that her department has set for 2030. So she's going to outline what some of those are and kind of how the sector at large is going to work together to achieve those. So super excited for that. We'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. And we'd love to see you with us there. But thank you again to all of you. Tina, you didn't thank yourself, but you did an amazing job putting this together. So great work. And thank you for being with us. And we look forward to seeing you at an Open Air event soon. Goodbye for now.